Sarah Martinez walked through the crowded hallway of Riverside Community College, with her head down, clutching her worn backpack tightly against her chest. At 28, she was older than most students here, but her small frame and quiet demeanor made her blend into the background like a shadow. Students rushed past her, laughing and chatting about weekend plans, completely unaware of the woman who moved silently among them. She wore the same faded jeans and oversized sweater she had worn for the past 3 days, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. There were no designer clothes, no expensive accessories, nothing that would draw attention to herself. This was exactly how Sarah preferred it. After 2 decades of being hyper-vigilant of scanning every room for threats and exits, she found peace in being invisible. The morning literature class was her favorite part of the day. Professor Williams always assigned seats in alphabetical order, which meant Sarah sat in the back corner by the window, perfect positioning to observe everything while remaining unnoticed. She pulled out her notebook, the same battered composition book she had been using for months, and prepared to take notes on today's discussion of war poetry. "Miss Martinez," Professor Williams called out, causing Sarah to look up from her notebook. "What are your thoughts on Wilfred Owen's portrayal of warfare in Duce et Decorum Est?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Owen writes from experience, sir. He shows the reality behind the propaganda. War isn't glorious or noble. It's about young people dying in terrible ways, far from home, while politicians make speeches about honor and duty." The classroom fell silent. Her voice had carried more weight than intended, revealing something deeper than academic analysis. Professor Williams nodded thoughtfully, but several students turned to stare at the quiet girl who usually never spoke unless directly asked. Among those staring were 3 young men who sat in the middle of the classroom. Jake Morrison, the self-appointed leader of their little group, was a 20-year-old with bleached hair and an attitude that screamed privilege. His father owned several car dealerships in town, and Jake never let anyone forget it. Beside him sat Tommy Chen, a 19-year-old who followed Jake's lead in everything, desperate to be accepted by someone he saw as cool and powerful. The third member of their trio was Marcus Williams, no relation to the professor, a hulking 21-year-old who had been held back twice and used his size to intimidate anyone who crossed their path. Jake had noticed Sarah weeks ago, not because she stood out, but because she didn't. She never spoke to anyone, never seemed to have any money, and always sat alone during lunch. To someone like Jake, who measured worth by social status and material possessions, Sarah represented everything he looked down upon. She was poor, friendless, and vulnerable. In his mind, she was the perfect target for their entertainment. After class ended, Sarah gathered her few belongings and headed toward her next destination, the campus library. She had discovered a quiet corner on the 3rd floor where she could study between classes without being disturbed. The library was her sanctuary, a place where her military training and observation could be useful in an entirely peaceful way. She knew every entrance and exit, every blind spot, every place where someone could approach unseen. But today felt different. As she climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, she noticed footsteps behind her that matched her pace too closely to be coincidental. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She cataloged the sounds, 3 sets of footsteps, slightly out of sync, suggesting the followers were trying to be quiet but lacked proper training. The weight distribution indicated young males, probably between 180 and 220 pounds each. Their breathing patterns suggested nervousness mixed with excitement. Sarah reached the 3rd floor and walked toward her usual corner table, but instead of sitting down, she continued to the far end of the floor where she knew there was emergency exit. She had memorized every exit in every building during her first week on campus, a habit that had kept her alive through multiple deployments in hostile territories. "Hey there, quiet girl," Jake's voice called out from behind her. "Where are you going so fast?" Sarah stopped and turned around slowly, keeping her hands relaxed at her sides. The 3 young men had spread out slightly, not quite surrounding her but positioning themselves to cut off easy escape routes. Amateur tactics, but effective against most civilians. "I'm just going to study," Sarah said softly, her voice betraying none of the tactical assessment running through her mind. "Is there something you need?" Tommy giggled nervously, looking to Jake for direction. Marcus cracked his knuckles, a sound that echoed in the quiet library space. Jake stepped forward with a confident smirk that reminded Sarah of certain types of soldiers she had encountered over the years, the ones who confused authority with bullying. Actually, yeah, there is something we need, Jake said, his voice taking on a menacing tone. See? We've been watching you, and we know you don't have much. But the thing is, we need some cash for the weekend, and you're going to help us out. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but internally, every alarm system in her brain activated. She calculated distances to exits, potential weapons in the environment, and the most efficient way to neutralize 3 opponents without causing permanent damage. Her breathing remained steady, controlled, exactly as she had been trained during countless hours of combat preparation. I don't have any money, Sarah said truthfully. Her GI Bill covered tuition and basic expenses, but there was never anything extra. She lived in a tiny studio apartment, ate mostly rice and beans, and owned exactly 3 changes of clothes. Oh, come on, Jake pressed, stepping closer. Everyone's got something. Check your pockets, check your bag. I bet you've got at least 20 or 30 bucks somewhere. Marcus moved to Sarah's left while Tommy circled to her right. They were creating a triangle formation, probably something they had seen in movies. It was sloppy execution, but it showed they had thought this through, which made them more dangerous than random opportunists. Sarah opened her backpack slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Inside were her textbooks, her notebook, a single pen, and exactly $3.47 in change at the bottom. She pulled out the coins and the crumpled dollar bills. This is all I have, she said, holding out the money. Jake looked at the pathetic collection of coins and bills with disgust. That's it? That's not even enough for a coffee. You've got to have more somewhere. Check her wallet, Tommy suggested, his voice cracking slightly with nervous energy. I don't have a wallet, Sarah replied. This is everything. The 3 young men exchanged glances. They had expected this to be easy, a quick grab of money from someone too scared to fight back. The reality of Sarah's poverty was frustrating their plan, but rather than backing down, Jake's entitlement kicked into high gear. This is bullshit, he muttered. Nobody's that broke. You're holding out on us. Marcus stepped forward, using his size to try to intimidate Sarah. Maybe we need to search her ourselves, make sure she's not hiding anything. This was the line that Sarah had been waiting for them to cross. Physical intimidation she could ignore, but the threat of assault activated 20 years of military training in protection of self and others. Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, weight distributing more evenly across both feet, hands moving to a ready position that could respond to attack from any direction. That won't be necessary, Sarah said, her voice remaining calm but carrying a different quality now, something that should have warned anyone with combat experience to reconsider their actions. But these 3 had never faced anyone with real training. They had bullied their way through high school and assumed college would be the same. They saw a small, quiet woman who appeared vulnerable and alone, and their teenage brains couldn't process any scenario where they weren't in complete control. Oh, I think it will be necessary, Jake said, reaching towards Sarah's backpack. Let's see what else you're hiding in there. Sarah allowed him to grab the bag, using his forward momentum to gauge his balance and reaction time. He was strong but clumsy, relying on size rather than technique. Tommy was nervous and would probably freeze if things got physical. Marcus was the real threat, bigger and more confident, but he was standing too close to the bookshelves to have full range of motion. Please don't do this, Sarah said, giving them one last chance to walk away. Part of her hoped they would take the warning and leave, because she knew that if this escalated, these 3 young men had no idea what they were about to face. Jake dumped the contents of her backpack onto the floor, scattering her textbooks and notebook across the carpet. When nothing valuable fell out, his frustration turned to anger. This is ridiculous. Nobody lives like this. Where do you keep your real stuff? Your phone, your credit cards, your jewelry? I don't have any of those things, Sarah replied honestly. Tommy picked up one of her textbooks and flipped through it, looking for hidden money. Marcus grabbed her notebook and started tearing out pages, apparently thinking she might have taped bills between the sheets. The casual destruction of her few possessions triggered something in Sarah that went beyond tactical assessment. These textbooks represented her future, her chance at a normal life after 2 decades of service. The notebook contained not just class notes but personal reflections, thoughts she had written down during her transition from military to civilian life. Watching these privileged children destroy the symbols of her hope for a peaceful future awakened the part of her that had spent years protecting others from exactly this kind of predatory behavior. "Stop," Sarah said, her voice carrying a tone of authority that had once commanded respect from hardened soldiers in combat zones. Jake looked up from rifling through her scattered belongings with surprise. The quiet, submissive girl had suddenly sounded like someone accustomed to being obeyed. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his face, but teenage arrogance quickly reasserted itself. "Did you just give me an order?" Jake laughed, though it sounded forced. "I don't think you understand how this works. We're in charge here." Marcus finished tearing up her notebook and let the pieces flutter to the ground like confetti. "Yeah, maybe you need to learn some respect." Sarah looked down at the scattered remains of her notebook, pages covered with her handwriting now torn and scattered across the library floor. Among the fragments, she could see pieces of her thoughts about adapting to civilian life, notes about finding purpose beyond military service, reflections on building a future where her skills could be used for creation rather than destruction. When she looked back up at the three young men, something fundamental had changed in her expression. The quiet, passive student was gone, replaced by someone whose eyes held the weight of experiences these boys couldn't imagine. "You have no idea what you've just done," Sarah said quietly. The tone of her voice should have been their final warning. It carried the calm certainty of someone who had faced life-and-death situations more times than these three had faced pop quizzes. It was the voice of someone who had made harder decisions before breakfast than they would make in their entire lives. But they were too young, too privileged, and too stupid to recognize danger when it spoke in a soft, controlled tone. "Oh, really?" Jake sneered. "And what exactly are you going to do about it?" Sarah looked at each of them in turn, memorizing their faces, calculating their positions, and making the kind of tactical decisions that had kept her and her units alive through multiple combat deployments. She had hoped to leave that part of her life behind, to be just another student pursuing an education and a peaceful future. But sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes predators force victims to remember exactly who they used to be. "You'll find out," Sarah said softly, kneeling down to gather the scattered pieces of her notebook and her textbooks. As she collected her destroyed belongings, Jake, Tommy, and Marcus stood over her, feeling proud of themselves for putting the weird, quiet girl in her place. They had no idea they had just made the worst mistake of their young lives. They had no idea that the small, quiet woman kneeling at their feet had spent the last 20 years learning exactly how to deal with people who thought they could take whatever they wanted from others through intimidation and violence. They were about to get an education that wasn't offered in any college catalog. The weekend arrived with Jake, Tommy, and Marcus feeling invincible. Their encounter with Sarah in the library had emboldened them, convincing them they had found the perfect victim. To their immature minds, her quiet response to their aggression meant she was weak, scared, and completely under their control. They spent Saturday night bragging to their friends about how they had put the weird girl in her place, embellishing the story with each telling. Sarah spent the weekend in her small studio apartment, carefully taping together the torn pages of her notebook. Each piece she reconstructed reminded her of why she had chosen to pursue education instead of remaining in the military. She had seen enough violence, participated in enough conflict, and lost enough friends to last several lifetimes. The transition to civilian life had been harder than any deployment, requiring her to suppress instincts and abilities that had defined her identity for 2 decades. But as she worked to repair the damage these 3 boys had done to her possessions, Sarah found herself thinking about patterns of behavior. In her years of service, she had learned to recognize predators. Jake, Tommy, and Marcus exhibited classic characteristics. They targeted those they perceived as vulnerable. They escalated when their initial aggression was successful, and they operated as a pack to amplify their individual confidence. Monday morning brought gray clouds and a chill that matched Sarah's mood. She arrived at campus early, as was her habit, and made her way to her first class. The literature professor was discussing themes of justice and revenge in classical works, a topic that resonated more deeply with Sarah than her classmates could know. During the break between classes, Sarah walked toward the campus coffee shop to buy her daily cup of coffee, one of her few small luxuries. The shop was crowded with students grabbing caffeine before their next lectures, creating the perfect environment for what Jake had planned as their next move. He had spent the weekend thinking about Sarah's claim that she only had $3.47. Nobody could live on so little money, he reasoned. She had to be hiding cash somewhere, probably in her dormitory room or wherever she lived off campus. If they could follow her home, they could find out where she really kept her money. Sarah noticed the surveillance immediately. Jake's attempt at casual observation was laughably obvious to someone trained in counterintelligence. He positioned himself near the coffee shop entrance, trying to look casual while watching her every move. Tommy lurked by the magazine rack, occasionally glancing in her direction. Marcus stood near the exit, presumably to follow her when she left. Their positioning revealed their complete lack of professional training. They were too close together, too obvious in their attention, and they had failed to account for alternative exits or the possibility that their target might be more aware than they assumed. Sarah could have lost them in dozens of ways, but she chose not to. Instead, she decided to give them exactly what they thought they wanted. After ordering her coffee, Sarah walked directly toward the campus parking lot. She moved slowly, deliberately, ensuring that her 3 followers could keep her in sight without difficulty. Her car was a 15-year-old Honda Civic with rust spots and a cracked windshield, the kind of vehicle that supported their assumption about her financial situation. As Sarah drove away from campus, she watched her mirrors carefully. Sure enough, Jake's bright red Mustang convertible followed at what he probably thought was a discreet distance. Sarah almost smiled at the irony. They were using a flashy sports car to conduct surveillance on someone they believed was too poor to own anything valuable. Sarah led them on a deliberately circuitous route through the less affluent part of town. She drove past pawn shops, discount stores, and run-down apartment complexes, reinforcing their preconceptions about her circumstances. Finally, she pulled into the parking lot of Sunset Gardens, a low-income housing complex that had seen better decades. Her apartment was exactly what someone would expect from her appearance and behavior. The studio was clean but sparse, furnished with items that looked like they had been purchased from thrift stores and garage sales. A small table served as both desk and dining room. A futon folded against the wall was her bed. The kitchenette contained only the most basic appliances and minimal food supplies. But Sarah's apartment held secrets that Jake, Tommy, and Marcus could never have imagined. Hidden behind false walls and concealed within modified furniture was equipment that told a very different story about who she really was. Military-grade communication devices, tactical gear, weapons that were legally owned but rarely seen outside of specialized units, and documentation of a service record that would have commanded respect from anyone who understood what it represented. Sarah had kept these things not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. 20 years of serving in the world's most dangerous places had taught her that peace was temporary, that threats could emerge without warning, and that the skills she had developed might someday be needed again. She had hoped that day would never come. From her window, Sarah could see Jake's Mustang parked across the street. The 3 young men sat inside, apparently planning their next move. She watched them for nearly an hour, observing their body language and behavior patterns. They were excited, probably discussing how they would approach her building and what they expected to find inside her apartment. Sarah used the time to prepare. She secured anything that might reveal her true background, ensuring that casual intruders would see only what she wanted them to see. Then she changed clothes, switching from her usual oversized sweater to a fitted t-shirt that wouldn't restrict her movement if action became necessary. She kept her appearance unchanged otherwise, maintaining the image of vulnerability that had made her a target. Around sunset, Jake finally made his move. Sarah watched from her window as the 3 young men exited the Mustang and approached her building. They moved with the swagger of people who had never faced real consequences for their actions, discussing their plan in voices loud enough to be heard from her 3rd-floor window. "The place looks pretty run down," Tommy observed nervously. "Maybe she really doesn't have anything worth taking." "Don't be stupid," Jake replied. "Nobody lives like she pretends to live. She's probably got cash hidden somewhere, plus whatever welfare money she gets. Poor people always have more than they admit to." Marcus cracked his knuckles again, a nervous habit that Sarah had already noted. "What if someone calls the cops? Look around." Jake gestured at the shabby apartment complex. "Nobody in a place like this calls cops for anything. These people handle their own problems." The irony of that statement was lost on all 3 of them. Sarah opened her apartment door before they could knock, startling them with her unexpected appearance. She had positioned herself to control the encounter from the beginning, standing in her doorway with her back to the interior of the apartment, blocking their view of her living space. "What do you want?" she asked quietly, though she already knew exactly why they were there. Jake recovered from his surprise quickly, his confidence returning as he remembered that they outnumbered her 3-1. "We want to talk to you about your little poverty act. See, we don't believe you're as broke as you claim to be." "I told you the truth in the library," Sarah replied. "I have very little money." "Right, well, we're going to need to verify that," Jake said, taking a step forward. "We want to come inside and look around. Make sure you're being honest with us." Sarah remained motionless in her doorway, but her positioning shifted slightly. Anyone with tactical training would have recognized the change, but these three saw only a small woman blocking their path into what they assumed was an apartment full of hidden valuables. "You can't come in," Sarah said firmly. "This is my home." Tommy giggled nervously. "I don't think you understand. We're not asking permission." Marcus moved to Sarah's left, probably intending to crowd her away from the door. It was exactly the kind of aggressive posturing that worked on most people, but Sarah wasn't most people. She had faced down-armed insurgents, navigated hostile territories where a single mistake meant death, and commanded respect from some of the toughest soldiers in the military. 3 college boys playing at intimidation was not going to impress her. "Step away from my door," Sarah said, her voice taking on the same tone of authority she had used in the library. "Or what?" Jake laughed. "You'll call security?" "Look around, princess. There is no security here. There's just us and you, and you're going to let us inside, or things are going to get very unpleasant for you." Sarah considered her options. She could retreat into her apartment and call the police, but response times in this neighborhood were notoriously slow. She could try to reason with them, but their behavior pattern suggested they had moved beyond rational discussion. Or she could end this situation using the skills she had spent 2 decades developing. "Last chance," Sarah said quietly. "Walk away now, and this doesn't have to go any further." Jake looked at Tommy and Marcus, and all 3 of them burst into laughter. The idea that this small, quiet woman could pose any threat to 3 strong young men struck them as absolutely hilarious. "Oh, we're terrified," Jake mocked. "What are you going to do? Tell the teacher on us?" Marcus reached out to push Sarah aside, intending to force his way into her apartment. It was exactly the mistake Sarah had been waiting for him to make. Sarah's response was so fast and precise that neither Tommy nor Jake initially understood what had happened. One moment Marcus was reaching toward her, and the next he was on the ground outside her apartment, gasping for air and clutching his wrist. The movement had been economical, almost gentle in its execution, but devastating in its effect. Sarah had redirected Marcus's forward momentum, used his own weight against him, and applied pressure to specific points that neutralized his ability to continue the assault without causing permanent injury. "What the hell?" Tommy stammered, staring at his friend writhing on the concrete walkway. Jake's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. In his worldview, physical confrontations followed predictable patterns. Bigger, stronger people dominated smaller, weaker ones. The idea that technique could overcome raw strength was foreign to his experience. "You got lucky," he snarled at Sarah. "But there are still 2 of us and 1 of you." Sarah remained in her doorway, completely calm despite having just physically engaged with an attacker. Her breathing was steady, her posture relaxed but ready. To someone with military experience, she would have looked like exactly what she was, a professional who had just executed a textbook defensive maneuver. To Jake and Tommy, she looked like someone who had gotten lucky once but wouldn't be able to repeat her success. "Marcus, get up," Jake ordered. "We're going inside whether she likes it or not." But Marcus wasn't getting up. The combination of pain, shock, and the realization that he had been completely outmatched by someone half his size had shattered his confidence. He remained on the ground, cradling his injured wrist and trying to process what had just happened to him. "I think maybe we should leave," Tommy said nervously, looking between Sarah and Marcus with growing unease. "We're not leaving," Jake snapped. "Nobody embarrasses me like this. Especially not some broke little nobody." Jake lunged toward Sarah with more aggression than technique, relying on anger and male privilege to overwhelm what he still assumed was just a lucky defensive move. He had never been in a real fight, never faced someone who understood violence as a precise tool rather than an emotional outburst. Sarah's second demonstration was even more educational than her first. Jake found himself face down on the concrete beside Marcus, his arm twisted behind his back in a position that made any movement extremely painful. The speed and efficiency of Sarah's response left him completely disoriented. "I warned you," Sarah said quietly, maintaining her grip on Jake's arm while keeping Tommy in her peripheral vision. "I told you to walk away." Tommy stared at his two friends on the ground and began backing away from Sarah's door. His teenage bravado had evaporated completely, replaced by the growing realization that they had made a terrible mistake. "Let him go," Tommy pleaded. "We'll leave. We won't bother you anymore." Sarah looked down at Jake, who was struggling uselessly against her hold. 20 years of experience had taught her to recognize when someone had learned their lesson versus when they were simply planning their next attack. Jake's body language suggested the latter. "Will you?" Sarah asked. "Because this feels like escalation to me. First you robbed me in the library. Now you're trying to break into my home. What comes next?" Jake tried to twist free, but Sarah's technique was flawless. Any movement he made only increased the pressure on his shoulder joint, forcing him to remain still or risk serious injury. "This isn't over," Jake gasped through gritted teeth. "You can't watch your back forever." Sarah sighed softly. She had hoped that a simple demonstration of capability would be enough to end this situation, but Jake's response confirmed what she had begun to suspect. These three weren't just opportunistic bullies. They were escalating predators who would continue to target her until the situation was resolved permanently. "You're right," Sarah said quietly. "This isn't over." She released Jake's arm and stepped back, allowing both young men to struggle to their feet. They gathered around Marcus, who was still nursing his injured wrist, and began moving toward the stairs. "This is crazy," Tommy muttered as they retreated. "Nobody said she knew how to fight." "Shut up," Jake snapped, his face burning with humiliation. "She just got lucky twice. Next time, we'll be ready for her." Sarah watched from her doorway as the three of them made their way to Jake's Mustang. She knew this wouldn't end here. Jake's pride had been wounded in front of his friends, and people like him didn't accept defeat gracefully. They would regroup, probably bring more people, and return with a plan designed to overwhelm her defensive capabilities through sheer numbers. As their car pulled away, Sarah went back inside her apartment and locked the door. Then she moved to her concealed equipment and began making preparations. If Jake and his friends wanted to escalate this situation, she would be ready for whatever they brought. After all, she had been preparing for war her entire adult life. The only question now was whether these three foolish young men would survive the education they were about to receive. Jake Morrison spent the next 3 days nursing his wounded pride and planning his revenge. The humiliation of being physically dominated by someone he had dismissed as weak and helpless ate at him like acid. In his privileged world, physical confrontations followed simple rules. Bigger and stronger always won. The fact that Sarah had violated these rules suggested to his adolescent mind that she had somehow cheated. He convinced himself that she must have taken self-defense classes, maybe learned a few moves from YouTube videos. There was no way a broke college student could be genuinely dangerous. His ego simply couldn't accept any other explanation for what had happened outside her apartment. Marcus's injured wrist provided a constant reminder of their failure, but rather than serving as a warning, it only fueled Jake's determination to restore his damaged reputation. He had told too many people about his plans to rob the quiet girl, to back down now. His social status depended on following through, regardless of the consequences. Tommy remained nervous about the entire situation. The memory of watching his friends disabled so quickly and efficiently haunted him, but peer pressure and fear of being labeled a coward kept him involved. He suggested they might want to reconsider their approach, maybe target someone else. But Jake rejected any discussion of retreat. "We're not backing down from some weird chick who knows a couple of karate moves," Jake declared during their Wednesday evening planning session in his dorm room. "We just need to be smarter about it." The solution, in Jake's mind, was simple: overwhelming force. If Sarah could handle 3 attackers, they would bring more people. His father's money and his own charisma had always allowed him to gather followers when needed. By Thursday afternoon, he had assembled a group of 8 young men, all eager to participate in what Jake described as teaching a lesson to someone who thought she was tough. The recruits were a mixture of Jake's fraternity brothers, athletes looking for excitement, and general troublemakers attracted by the promise of easy money and the chance to intimidate someone weaker than themselves. Jake had carefully edited the story of their previous encounters, portraying Sarah as a lucky amateur who had caught them off guard with a few basic moves. "She's living in some crappy apartment complex," Jake explained to his assembled crew. "Probably dealing drugs or something, which is why she didn't want us inside. We go there Friday night, all of us together, and she won't be able to pull any of her martial arts nonsense." What Jake didn't mention was that Marcus had done some research on Sarah Martinez. Using his father's connections in local law enforcement, Marcus had run her name through various databases, looking for any information that might explain her unexpected fighting ability. The results had been disturbing. Sarah Martinez had no criminal record, no history of martial arts competitions, no obvious explanation for her combat skills. But there was something strange about her background. Large gaps in her documented history, minimal social media presence, and an address history that showed frequent relocations to different states. Most troubling was what Marcus had discovered about her current situation. Despite appearing to be a typical struggling college student, Sarah Martinez was receiving benefits from the Department of Veterans Affairs. She was a military veteran, though the details of her service were not available through civilian databases. Marcus had shared this information with Tommy, but not with Jake. Both younger men were beginning to suspect they had stumbled into something more complicated than a simple robbery, but neither had the courage to confront Jake with their concerns. They knew he would interpret any expression of doubt as cowardice and turn the group against them. Meanwhile, Sarah had not been idle. Her own intelligence gathering was far more sophisticated than anything Jake's group could manage. She had identified all three of her original attackers within hours of their first encounter, using techniques learned during years of operating in hostile environments, where knowing your enemies could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah knew Jake's full name, his father's business holdings, his academic record, and his history of minor legal troubles that Daddy's money had made disappear. She knew Tommy's immigration status, his family's financial struggles, and his desperation to fit in with wealthier students. She knew Marcus's academic probation, his steroid use, and his father's position with the local police department. More importantly, Sarah had been monitoring their activities since Monday night. She had placed surveillance devices in locations where the three friends regularly gathered, giving her advance warning of their plans. By Thursday evening, she knew exactly who they had recruited and what they intended to do. 8 young men against 1 small woman should have been overwhelming odds. But Jake's recruits had no idea what they were walking into. Sarah Martinez had spent 20 years in special operations, conducting missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and other locations that didn't exist in any official records. She had been part of units that operated behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence and eliminating targets that posed threats to national security. Her transition to civilian life had been voluntary, the result of accumulated trauma and a desire to find purpose beyond violence. But the skills she had developed over 2 decades of service didn't simply disappear because she had changed her environment. Muscle memory, tactical thinking, and combat instincts remained as sharp as ever. Friday evening arrived with Jake's group gathering in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant near Sarah's apartment complex. The 8 young men ranged in age from 19 to 22, all of them confident in their physical abilities and excited about the easy victory they expected to achieve. "Remember, we go in fast and hard," Jake instructed his followers. "She might try to lock herself in her apartment, so we need to get through the door before she can secure it. Once we're inside, she won't have anywhere to run." None of them questioned the wisdom of breaking into someone's home. They were young, privileged, and accustomed to getting what they wanted without considering consequences. In their minds, Sarah was just a target, not a real person with rights or the ability to defend herself. Sarah watched their approach from her darkened apartment window. 8 figures moving through the parking lot with the subtlety of a marching band, laughing and joking as they climbed the stairs to her floor. Their complete lack of tactical awareness would have been amusing if it weren't so dangerous. She had considered calling the police, but response times in her neighborhood were unreliable, and she doubted that 8 college students would face serious consequences even if they were arrested. Jake's family connections would probably result in charges being dropped or reduced to misdemeanors. The cycle would continue with different victims. Instead, Sarah had prepared her apartment for the confrontation she knew was coming. Furniture had been moved to create clear fields of movement and eliminate hiding places where attackers could take cover. Lights were positioned to create shadows and blind spots that would work to her advantage. Every potential weapon in the environment had been cataloged and positioned for easy access. Most importantly, Sarah had set up recording equipment to document whatever happened. 20 years of military service had taught her the importance of evidence and documentation. Whatever occurred tonight, there would be a complete record of who initiated the violence and how the situation escalated. The knock on her door came exactly when Sarah expected it, followed immediately by Jake's voice demanding that she open up. There was no pretense of civility this time, no attempt to disguise their intentions as anything other than a home invasion. "We know you're in there," Jake called out. "We're not leaving until we get what we came for." Sarah opened the door wearing the same oversized sweater and jeans that had helped convince them she was weak and defenseless. 8 young men crowded the narrow walkway outside her apartment, their confidence visible in their posture and expressions. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "What we wanted before," Jake replied. "Your money, your stuff, and an apology for the other night. But now the price has gone up. You embarrassed us, so now you owe us for that too." Sarah looked at each of the 8 faces surrounding her door. Most of them she didn't recognize, but their body language told her everything she needed to know. They were followers, not leaders, brought here by promises of easy money and adventure. They had no idea what Jake had gotten them into. "I told you before I don't have any money," Sarah said quietly. "And I'm not apologizing for defending myself." One of Jake's recruits, a heavily muscled young man who looked like he spent most of his time in the gym, stepped forward aggressively. "Lady, there are 8 of us, and 1 of you. You can do this the easy way or the hard way, but either way, we're coming inside." Sarah assessed the tactical situation with the automatic precision of someone who had made similar calculations countless times in far more dangerous circumstances. 8 opponents, confined space, civilian environment with potential for collateral damage to neighbors, multiple escape routes available, but retreat would only delay the inevitable confrontation. "The hard way it is then," Sarah said softly. What happened next would be analyzed and discussed for years by law enforcement professionals who reviewed the security footage. Sarah Martinez moved with a speed and precision that demonstrated training far beyond anything available to civilian martial artists. Her actions were economical, targeted, and devastatingly effective. The first attacker, the muscular young man who had threatened her, found himself unconscious on the concrete walkway before his brain could process how he had gotten there. The second discovered that his arm would no longer function properly after Sarah applied pressure to specific nerve clusters. The third learned that size and strength meant nothing when facing someone who understood human anatomy and leverage. Jake watched in horror as his carefully assembled crew was systematically dismantled by a woman who moved like violence was a language she spoke fluently. His followers were strong, athletic young men who had dominated high school sports and college social scenes, but none of them had ever faced someone who understood combat as a professional skill rather than an emotional outburst. Within 90 seconds, 6 of Jake's 8 recruits were on the ground, either unconscious or unable to continue fighting due to precisely applied joint locks and pressure point attacks. Tommy and Marcus stood frozen against the wall, too terrified to advance and too ashamed to retreat. "This is impossible," Jake whispered, staring at the carnage Sarah had created without apparent effort. Sarah stood in her doorway, breathing normally, her clothes barely rumpled by the encounter. Around her feet lay 6 young men who had learned the difference between bullying and combat. The demonstration had been surgical in its precision, designed to disable without causing permanent injury. "No," Sarah replied quietly. "This is 20 years of training." Jake's face went white as the implications of her statement sank in. "You're military. Was military," Sarah corrected. "Special forces. 20 years of active duty in places you can't pronounce, doing things that don't appear in any official records." The 2 conscious attackers, Tommy and Marcus, stared at Sarah with dawning horror. They had targeted someone they assumed was weak and defenseless, but they had actually been stalking a professional soldier with 2 decades of combat experience. "Special Forces doesn't accept women," Marcus said weakly, trying to deny the evidence of his own eyes. Sarah smiled for the first time since this entire situation began. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Special Forces officially doesn't accept women. Officially, I was never in Special Forces. Officially, the missions I conducted never happened, and the people I killed in service of my country never existed. Jake backed away from Sarah's door, finally understanding that he had made a mistake of potentially fatal proportions.
We didn't know.
Nobody told us you were military. You didn't ask, Sarah replied. You saw someone you thought was weak and decided to take what you wanted. That's what predators do. They target those they believe can't fight back. One of the unconscious attackers began to stir, groaning as he tried to understand why he was lying on cold concrete instead of standing upright. Sarah glanced down at him with professional interest, calculating how long each of her opponents would remain disabled. Here's what's going to happen, Sarah continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders in life-or-death situations. You're going to gather up your friends and leave. You're never going to approach me again, never going to threaten me again, and never going to target anyone else the way you targeted me. And if we don't? Jake asked, though his voice cracked with fear. Sarah's smile became even less pleasant. Jake Morrison, son of Robert Morrison, who owns Morrison Auto Group, lives at 1247 Elm Street in the suburbs, attends Riverside Community College on Daddy's money because his grades weren't good enough for a real university, has a sealed juvenile record for assault that disappeared when Daddy made a substantial donation to the Police Benevolent Fund. Jake's face went ashen as Sarah recited details about his life that she should have no way of knowing. Tommy Chen, Sarah continued, turning to the second young man, here on a student visa that could be revoked for any criminal activity. Parents own Golden Dragon Restaurant on 5th Street, struggling to make payments on the loan they took out to send their son to America for a better life. Tommy began shaking as he realized the implications of what Sarah was telling him. And Marcus Williams, Sarah finished, looking at the third member of the original trio, whose father is Detective Lieutenant James Williams of the Riverside Police Department. I wonder how the lieutenant would feel about his son conducting home invasions and assaults. The three young men stared at Sarah with complete terror. She knew everything about them, everything that mattered, everything that could destroy their lives if the information fell into the wrong hands. I know all of you, Sarah said simply. I know where you live, where you work, where you go to school, and where you're vulnerable. I know about your families, your finances, and your futures. If any of you ever threaten me or anyone else again, I will use that information to destroy you systematically and completely. Jake tried to speak but could only manage a weak croak. Sarah had just demonstrated that she possessed not only the physical skills to neutralize them, but also intelligence-gathering capabilities that reached into every aspect of their private lives. Do we understand each other? Sarah asked. All three conscious attackers nodded frantically. Around their feet, the unconscious members of Jake's crew were beginning to wake up, confused and disoriented by their unexpected encounter with professional-level combat training. Good, Sarah said. Now collect your friends and leave my home. This is the only warning you'll receive. As the 8 young men struggled to their feet and stumbled toward the stairs, Sarah called out one final warning. And, gentlemen, if I hear about any of you targeting other students, other women, or anyone else you think might be an easy victim, our next conversation will be very different. I've spent 20 years protecting people from predators. Don't give me a reason to add you to that list. The threat hung in the air as Jake's defeated crew made their way to the parking lot. They had come expecting to terrorize a helpless victim, but instead, they had received an education in the difference between perceived strength and actual power. Sarah watched from her window as they drove away, 8 young men who would carry the memory of this night for the rest of their lives. Some would learn from the experience and become better people. Others would simply become more careful about choosing their targets. But none of them would ever forget the quiet girl who turned out to be one of the most dangerous people they would ever meet. The weekend following the confrontation passed in an eerie quiet that felt more ominous than peaceful. Jake Morrison sat in his expensive dorm room, staring at walls covered with posters of sports cars and swimsuit models, trying to process what had happened to his carefully constructed world. The 8 young men who had accompanied him to Sarah's apartment had scattered like leaves in a hurricane, none of them willing to discuss the details of their humiliation. Word had spread through the campus social networks with the speed that only gossip can achieve. The story had been twisted and embellished with each telling, but the core facts remained consistent. Jake Morrison and his crew had tried to intimidate the wrong person and paid a devastating price for their arrogance. Most students dismissed the rumors as exaggerated nonsense. The idea that quiet, mousy Sarah Martinez was some kind of deadly warrior seemed absurd to anyone who had seen her hunched over textbooks in the library. But those closest to Jake's inner circle knew something significant had happened. His swagger had been replaced by nervous glances over his shoulder, and he had stopped making threats about teaching anyone any lessons. Sarah continued attending her classes as if nothing had changed, but she was hyper-aware of the shifting dynamics around her. Students who had never noticed her before now watched her with curiosity and speculation. Professors who had previously seen her as just another struggling older student began to observe her with new interest, noting the way she carried herself and the quality of her insights during discussions. The literature professor, Dr. Talibasukame Williams, found himself particularly intrigued by Sarah's analysis of war poetry. Her comments carried a weight and authenticity that suggested personal experience with the subjects being discussed. When she spoke about the psychological impact of combat or the difficulty of transitioning from military to civilian life, her words had the ring of first-hand knowledge rather than academic theory. Tuesday morning brought an unexpected development. Detective Lieutenant James Williams, Marcus's father, appeared at Sarah's apartment complex. He was a 25-year veteran of the police force, a man who had seen enough violence and stupidity to recognize both when he encountered them. Sarah opened her door to find a tall, graying man in a rumpled suit holding a badge and wearing an expression of professional courtesy mixed with parental concern. She recognized him immediately from her research into Marcus's background, but she waited for him to speak first. "Miss Martinez? I'm Lieutenant Williams with the Riverside Police Department. I was hoping we could have a conversation about some recent incidents involving my son and his friends." Sarah stepped aside to allow him into her apartment, noting his subtle assessment of the space and her positioning. He was an experienced law enforcement officer trained to observe and evaluate potential threats. His presence suggested that the situation had moved beyond simple college student drama. "Please, sit down," Sarah offered, gesturing toward her small table. "Would you like some coffee?" Lieutenant Williams accepted the offer, using the time to study Sarah's apartment and her demeanor. What he saw contradicted everything he had expected based on his son's description of their victim. The apartment was sparse but meticulously organized, clean to a degree that suggested military training. Sarah moved with economy and awareness that spoke of professional discipline. "My son came home Friday night with some interesting injuries," Lieutenant Williams began, settling into the offered chair. Strained wrist, bruised ribs, and a very creative explanation for how he acquired them. Sarah poured coffee into two mismatched mugs, her movements deliberate and controlled. "I'm sorry to hear that Marcus was injured. I hope it wasn't too serious." "Oh, it wasn't serious at all," the lieutenant replied with a slight smile. "Very precisely applied, actually. Just enough force to disable without causing permanent damage. The work of someone with extensive training in non-lethal combat techniques." Sarah sat across from him, meeting his gaze directly. "Is there something specific you'd like to know, Lieutenant?" "Well, for starters, I'd like to understand why 8 college students felt it was necessary to visit your apartment Friday evening, and I'd like to know how one woman managed to send them all home with such educational injuries." Sarah considered her response carefully. Lieutenant Williams was not his son. He was a professional law enforcement officer with decades of experience, someone who understood violence and its consequences. She could speak to him honestly in ways that would be impossible with civilians. "Your son and his friends have been harassing me for several weeks," Sarah said simply. "They robbed me in the campus library, destroyed my property, and then decided to escalate to breaking into my home. I defended myself using appropriate force." "Appropriate force," Lieutenant Williams repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting phrase. Very specific terminology for someone who supposedly has no formal training." Sarah sipped her coffee and remained silent, allowing the lieutenant to draw his own conclusions. "I did some research on you, Miss Martinez," he continued. "Interesting background. Large gaps in your documented history, Virginia benefits, and a very clean record that suggests someone who knows how to avoid creating paperwork trails. Research is important, Sarah agreed. It helps people understand what they're dealing with before they make irreversible mistakes. Lieutenant Williams leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with the attention of someone solving a complex puzzle. 20 years? 20 years. Special operations? Sarah neither confirmed nor denied the question, but her slight nod was answer enough. And these boys had no idea what they were walking into. None whatsoever, Sarah confirmed. They saw someone they thought was weak and defenseless. They made assumptions based on appearances and economic circumstances. Lieutenant Williams shook his head slowly, caught between professional admiration and paternal concern. My son could have been seriously injured. All of them could have been. They weren't, Sarah replied quietly. I used the minimum force necessary to end the threat. No one sustained anything worse than bruises and strained joints. They'll all recover completely within a week or two. But you could have done much worse. It wasn't a question, and Sarah didn't treat it like one. Lieutenant, I spent 2 decades learning how to neutralize threats efficiently and permanently. If I had wanted to seriously injure those young men, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The detective understood the implications immediately. His son and his friends had attempted to assault someone capable of killing them all without breaking a sweat. Only Sarah's restraint and professionalism had prevented a tragedy that would have destroyed multiple families. What happens now? Lieutenant Williams asked. That depends on them, Sarah replied. I made it clear that any future harassment would be met with escalated responses. If they leave me alone and stop targeting other vulnerable students, this ends here. If they don't, she left the sentence unfinished, but the message was clear. Lieutenant Williams finished his coffee and stood to leave. I'll make sure my son understands the situation. And I'll ensure that Jake Morrison and the others receive appropriate counseling about making better choices. I appreciate that, Sarah said, walking him to the door. The lieutenant paused on her threshold, looking back with an expression of professional respect. For what it's worth, Miss Martinez, you handled this situation with remarkable restraint. A lot of people with your background would have responded differently. I didn't serve my country for 20 years just to come home and hurt American kids, Sarah replied. But I also won't allow predators to victimize people just because they think their targets can't fight back. After Lieutenant Williams left, Sarah returned to her daily routine, but she remained watchful for signs that the situation might not be as resolved as it appeared. Her experience had taught her that young men like Jake Morrison rarely accepted defeat gracefully, especially when their humiliation had become public knowledge. Wednesday brought confirmation of her concerns. Sarah noticed increased surveillance around her apartment complex and campus movements, not from Jake's original crew, but from new faces that appeared too frequently in her vicinity to be coincidental. Someone was gathering intelligence, possibly planning a more sophisticated approach to their vendetta. Sarah's military training had included extensive work in counterintelligence and surveillance detection. She began documenting the new watchers, photographing faces, and recording patterns of behavior. What she discovered was both alarming and illuminating. Jake Morrison had reached out to contacts beyond the college campus. Using his father's business connections and his own social networks, he had hired what could only be described as professional muscle. 3 men with criminal backgrounds, experience in intimidation and debt collection, and a willingness to escalate situations far beyond what college students would consider. The professionals were better at surveillance than Jake's amateur crew, but they still weren't good enough to avoid detection by someone with Sarah's training. She identified all 3 within 48 hours and compiled detailed intelligence files on their backgrounds, capabilities, and probable intentions. Thursday evening brought the confrontation Sarah had been expecting. The 3 professionals approached her apartment with tactical awareness that immediately distinguished them from the college students she had faced previously. They moved with purpose, maintained proper spacing, and positioned themselves to control escape routes and observation angles. Sarah watched their approach from her window, noting their coordination and equipment. These men were armed, probably with concealed firearms, and they had clearly been briefed about her capabilities. This was no longer about college student harassment. Jake Morrison had escalated the situation to the level of professional violence. Sarah retrieved her own equipment from its concealment and prepared for a very different kind of confrontation. The rules of engagement had changed fundamentally. These were not misguided young men who could be taught a lesson and sent home to reconsider their choices. These were professionals who understood violence as a business transaction and would respond only to overwhelming force. The knock on her door came with none of the bravado that had accompanied Jake's previous visits. When Sarah opened it, she faced 3 men who studied her with the assessment of experienced predators evaluating potential prey. "Sarah Martinez?" the lead man asked, his voice carrying the flat professionalism of someone accustomed to intimidation work. "Yes. We understand you've been having some difficulties with some local young men. We're here to resolve that situation permanently." Sarah recognized the phrasing immediately. This was a threat delivered in language designed to provide plausible deniability while making the implications crystal clear. These men had been hired to eliminate her as a problem, probably with instructions to make it look like an accident or robbery gone wrong. "I see," Sarah replied calmly. "And who exactly sent you to resolve this situation?" The lead man smiled without warmth. "That's not really relevant to our conversation. What's relevant is that you understand how this needs to end." Sarah assessed the tactical situation with the automatic precision of someone who had faced similar circumstances in hostile territories around the world. 3 armed professionals, confined space, civilian environment with innocent neighbors nearby. The situation required careful handling to minimize collateral damage while ensuring her own survival. "I understand perfectly," Sarah said quietly. What happened next demonstrated the difference between professional violence and amateur intimidation. Sarah moved with the lethal precision of someone who had spent 2 decades eliminating threats to national security. Her response was not the educational demonstration she had provided to the college students. This was combat, executed with the efficiency of someone whose life had depended on such skills more times than she could count. The first professional never had the opportunity to draw his concealed weapon. Sarah's attack was so fast and precise that he collapsed unconscious before his nervous system could process the threat. The second man managed to reach for his gun but found his arm disabled by a strike that severed specific nerve pathways, leaving his hand useless. The third professional, the leader, was more experienced and better trained than his companions. He actually managed to draw his weapon and fire a single shot before Sarah neutralized him. The bullet struck the wall behind where she had been standing a fraction of a second earlier, embedding itself in plaster instead of human tissue. The entire confrontation lasted less than 20 seconds. When it ended, 3 professional criminals lay unconscious or disabled on Sarah's walkway, and their weapons had been secured and field-stripped with military efficiency. Sarah surveyed the aftermath of the encounter with professional detachment. The gunshot would bring police attention within minutes. The weapons would require explanation. The 3 men would need medical attention for their injuries, though none were life-threatening. Most importantly, the escalation pattern suggested that Jake Morrison had moved beyond harassment into territory that required permanent resolution. Sarah could no longer treat this as a college discipline problem. Professional criminals had been hired to eliminate her, which meant the situation had evolved into something that demanded a military response. Sarah made a series of phone calls to numbers that didn't appear in any civilian directory. Within an hour, unmarked vehicles arrived at her apartment complex. Men and women in suits began documenting the scene and questioning witnesses with the authority of federal law enforcement. The 3 unconscious professionals were removed for medical treatment and processing through systems that would ensure they faced consequences appropriate to their actions. Jake Morrison was arrested at his dorm room that evening on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, hiring criminal organizations, and a dozen other federal offenses that his father's local connections couldn't make disappear. The investigation that followed revealed a network of privileged young men who had been using violence and intimidation to prey on vulnerable students for years. Sarah's role in exposing this network was officially classified, but the results were visible to anyone who cared to notice. Campus harassment incidents dropped dramatically. Students who had previously felt vulnerable began reporting threats instead of suffering in silence. The culture of intimidation that had allowed predators like Jake to operate with impunity was systematically dismantled. 3 weeks after the final confrontation, Sarah sat in her literature class listening to a discussion about themes of justice and transformation in classical works. Around her, students debated questions of right and wrong, the use of violence in pursuing justice, and the responsibility of individuals to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Professor Williams called on Sarah for her thoughts on whether violence could ever be justified in pursuit of justice. Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "I think," she said quietly, "that justice requires people to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. Sometimes that can be accomplished through words and education. Sometimes it requires more direct action. The key is using only the force necessary to protect the innocent and stop the predators." After class, several students approached Sarah with questions and comments. Word of her background had spread through unofficial channels, and she had become something of a legend on campus. Students who had been targets of harassment sought her advice. Others simply wanted to express their gratitude for making the campus a safer place. Sarah accepted their thanks graciously but made it clear that she had simply done what any responsible person should do when faced with predators targeting the vulnerable. She had used her unique skills and background to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. But the real work of creating a safe environment required everyone to take responsibility for each other's welfare. Months later, Sarah graduated with honors and moved on to a career in private security, specializing in protecting corporate executives and government officials in dangerous environments. But she maintained connections with Riverside Community College, occasionally returning to speak with students about personal safety and the importance of standing up to bullies and predators. Jake Morrison served 5 years in federal prison before being released on supervised probation. The experience had transformed him from an entitled predator into someone who understood the consequences of his actions. He spent his remaining years working in victim advocacy, trying to prevent other young people from making the same mistakes that had destroyed his privileged future. Tommy Chen completed his education and returned to help run his family's restaurant. But he never forgot the lesson he had learned about the difference between perceived weakness and actual vulnerability. He became involved in community organizations that supported immigrants and worked to prevent the kind of harassment that had once seemed acceptable to him. Marcus Williams followed his father into law enforcement, but with a perspective shaped by his encounter with Sarah Martinez. He specialized in investigating crimes against vulnerable populations and became known for his ability to identify and stop predators before they could escalate their behavior. The story of Sarah Martinez and the foolish recruits who tried to rob the quiet girl became part of campus folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of making assumptions about people based on appearances. But for those who lived through it, the real lesson was about the importance of standing up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. Sarah had spent 20 years serving her country in conflicts around the world, but her greatest victory had been achieved in a small apartment complex, protecting fellow students from predators who thought their privilege made them untouchable. It was a reminder that heroism comes in many forms, and sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign soil, but in the quiet corners of everyday life where the vulnerable need protection from those who would prey upon them. The quiet girl had revealed herself to be exactly what her attackers had never expected: someone with the skills, experience, and determination to stand between predators and their intended victims. And in doing so, she had changed not only their lives, but the entire culture of the institution they all shared.